You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Rick McKenna, but today is the frustrating case of Bernard Oliver. Now, this was a crime scene made of nightmares and a whirlwind of suspects. Who was keeping secrets? Who got away with murder? And why were investigators putting off listening to a witness statement from 50 years ago when this actually happened? By the way, I post so much content like this, and it would be my absolute honor if you would subscribe to me, and it would make me so incredibly happy if you would give this a thumbs up and comment down below. But let's get back to the story. So it was 1967 in North London, and Bernard Micheal Oliver was a 17-year-old living with his family in Muswell Hill. Now, he had 5 siblings, and he lived with his father as well, and he was known to be a gentle and friendly boy, and he was also known to kind of have a mental age that was a bit younger than his peers. Many said that it was more like he was 11 than that he was actually 17. Now, he went to a special needs school, and he also worked in a local warehouse. Now, he had trouble reading and writing, and he was definitely more of an introvert, but when he did feel comfortable and he did speak, he was actually quite funny. He loved being outdoors in the woods. He loved hanging out with people when they wanted to hang out with him, and he loved walking the family's pet poodle named Pepe. Now, his mother Sheila had just left his father George about a year prior to this, so they were still adjusting as a family, that all of the children still lived with their father, and Bernard kind of liked this because he liked to be independent and do his own thing, and because his father had 5 children to look after, he was kind of allowed to do so because his father wasn't necessarily watching him like a hawk 24/7. So on January 6th of 1967, Bernard went out with some friends, told his father he was going to do so, and headed out. However, he wouldn't come home that night. He wouldn't come home the next morning, and of course his father called the police at this point. There was no evidence of him anywhere in town. Many witnesses said they had seen him around town but hadn't seen him recently. They wouldn't find any clues until 10 days later, and it was January 16th when a farm worker named Fred Brugge would be working in his field near Taddington, Suffolk, and he would come across 2 suitcases. This was behind a hedge near Bentley Lane, and it was very odd for these objects to be in the middle of a field. I mean, this was about an hour and a half from Muswell Hill, and Fred had no idea why somebody would have just dumped these bags. However, his curiosity got the best of him, and he decided to open them, only to find the body of a young boy who had been dismembered. Now, the body was in 8 pieces, disposed of in 2 suitcases, and these cuts were done very neatly, as though somebody knew exactly what they were doing. One of the suitcases was a blue-gray color, and the other was a light cream. And this was the very last thing that Fred expected to see when he opened the suitcase, but as soon as he did, it took him a moment to collect himself, and then he immediately went to go find a phone to call the police. Now, once the police knew about this, so did the entire town. News traveled so incredibly quickly. His body was brought in for an autopsy, where they found that he had been sexually assaulted and had died about 48 hours before Fred had found him. He was also found only wearing a jacket. And without the instant communication that we have today, no one in Taddingstone knew about the disappearance in Muswell Hill, and nobody in Muswell Hill knew about the body found in Taddingstone. So everybody just thought that they had an unidentified body in one place and a missing boy in the other, and it took them quite a while to actually connect the two. Investigators began to look at other possible identifying factors of the crime scene so they could trace it back to either who this boy was or who the killer was. And they found on one of the suitcases it had the initials PVA on it. There was also a hand towel in the suitcases, and it had the marking of QL42 inside, which is kind of for like a laundry mat for it to get back to the right owner. There was also a matchbox found in Bernard's jacket that was made in Israel. But other than that, there was nothing, no other clues to help in this case at all. And with no luck finding this boy, the investigators actually decided to hire a funeral worker to dress him up, his head at least. A scarf was put around the bottom of his head, and his face was kind of propped up, his eyelids were open, and they took his picture to put in the newspaper to hopefully identify this boy. And that is ultimately what would identify him. They found that this boy had just had his hair cut as well as his nails manicured and had just eaten a meal before his death. Now, back in Muswell Hill, Bernard's younger brothers would be waiting at a bus stop when one of their friends was reading a newspaper and said, "That's your brother, isn't it?" The two boys would go over to this friend in this newspaper and read the article that said suitcase murder. There was a huge picture of the boy's face on the cover, and it read, "The victim was in his late teens or early 20s, about 5'3", slim build, dark brown hair, inclined to be wavy or curly, gray or gray-blue eyes, numerous moles in his right cheek, several more on the right side of his neck, and a few on his left cheek. He also had 2 small scars, both old, one near the bridge of his nose and the other on the right-hand knuckle joint, and he seemed to be in the habit of biting his nails." These young boys had just found out where their brother had gone, and now they had to deal with the fact that he had been murdered, and they were only kids themselves when they knew this and had to tell their father what they had found and what they knew. And Bernard was officially identified on January 20th, but this family had to go through even more trauma when his own family was being questioned in his murder. They searched the Oliver home and in George the father's car, and they interviewed them relentlessly. And at this point, Bernard's siblings all just kind of felt quiet. They were in such a state of shock, and they even said, "Really, none of us spoke to each other about it because we were so hurt. It was difficult to bring the subject up and to talk about it. I can't turn around to you and say it's life, because it's not. It's not what you expect to happen. It's absolutely devastating." His family said that they knew nothing about him recently having a haircut or having his nails manicured, and detectives then said that they were going to interview every gay man in London because they believed a gay man had done this, even though there was no evidence against that or no suspects, and there was no reason why they really believed it was a gay man. Now, a witness did come forward at this point saying that she was driving on Harwich Road when she had seen a man, and this was the night before the suitcases were found, and this man was wearing a dark tribly or a hat and a long trench coat, and he was allegedly walking with a suitcase in hand towards Taddingstone. Investigators had also gotten a tip that there were cottages around this area in a village where seamen would often go and party, and they believed this could possibly have been where Bernard had gone and where he was possibly murdered, because they also didn't believe that where he was found was where he was murdered, because obviously the dismemberment would have had other signs in the area. No evidence was said to be found there. They searched homes in Taddingstone, no evidence there, and they also interviewed up to 2,000 people, but only a handful of people were really looked into, and that was because they truly believed that this person had some sort of medical experience, that this killer had to have been some sort of doctor due to how precise the dismemberment actually was. However, there was a man who was thought to be very suspicious who was not a doctor. And the only reason they really looked into him was because he was Bernard's boss. Now, his name was Joe Meeks, and he owned a recording studio that Bernard would work at as a tape stacker. And Joe could not be interviewed because he had actually committed suicide just about a week after Bernard was found. And he had also killed his landlady at the same time. Now, a little bit about Joe's past was that it was said that he had a very strange past. He was dressed up as a girl until he was about 4, which, you know, is no problem if that's what the child wants. However, it was said that that's not what Joe wanted. He was forced to. And he was also known to have lots of mental health issues growing up and even into adulthood, and have lots of paranoia as well. But the 2 prime suspects were doctors. At least that's what it was said to be when the case was reopened in 1977, 10 years after the actual murder. The first one was a Dr. Martin Bruce Reddington, who actually lived in Muswell Hill. He had actually been wanted 2 years prior to the murder in 1965 for indecent assault of males, but fled to South Africa before anything could actually be done about it. He often traveled back to the UK, and no one really knew when this was or where it was, but he was known to be in the UK sometimes, which could put him being where Bernard was at the time, but it couldn't be exactly confirmed that he was in Muswell Hill or Taddingstone during this times. But he was also said to be a suspect in a murder that happened in 1973, a few years after Bernard's murder, where the suspect ended up in a suitcase as well. It was a boy in London who ended up in 2 suitcases in pieces. It was said that this victim had been in a gay relationship, or at least in some sort of sexual manner with their killer, but Dr. Reddington couldn't be confirmed or denied as a part of that case either. In 1977, after this case had been reopened, Dr. Reddington was actually picked out of a lineup of photographs from a woman who had seen this suitcase that Bernard had been found in a laundromat, and she had remembered seeing this man take his dirty clothes out of this suitcase, and it was the exact same suitcase. So they brought her in and kind of put a lineup, and she picked Dr. Reddington out and said, that's the guy that was in the laundromat. However, nothing was ever done with this evidence and this witness statement. Then another suspect we have is Dr. John Ursal Biles, and he was also a suspect in the murder of the boy in London that was found in the suitcase. But before that, 4 years prior to Bernard's murder in 1963, he had actually been acquitted of sexually assaulting a 16-year-old male in his own apartment. Now, Dr. Biles was actually suspected of sexually assaulting many young boys throughout the years, even at the time of Bernard's murder, but he fled to Australia in the 1970s to get away with it, and he really did. However, he was there arrested in 1974 for the sexual assault of a boy, but posted bail. However, the next year, Dr. Biles would die of suicide and leave behind 2 suicide notes, one of which was going to Scotland Yard and the other going to Dr. Reddington. Now, the one to the Scotland Yard said that he apologized for his actions, and many believed this meant in Bernard's murder. However, that can't be confirmed, and the note to Dr. Reddington, it was never specified what that exactly said. At this point, Dr. Biles was yet another suspect that they couldn't talk to. They still could talk to Dr. Reddington because he didn't die until 1995. However, they didn't because they didn't have enough evidence to, and they just never did. Now, another interesting suspect who was not a doctor was found to be an Australian DJ named Tony Windsor. And at the time of Bernard's murder, he was actually a DJ on a ship that was docked about 12 miles from Taddingstone called the MV Galaxy. Now, Tony was brought in for questioning because he was an alcoholic, he was gay, and he had also been friends with Joe Meeks, the recording studio owner that worked with Bernard. Now, nothing was really done involving this Australian DJ, but they did go on the ship at one point to look at any possible information they could get, and they were looking at the Dutch crew members because they believed that the initials on the suitcase, PVA, could have been for a Dutch name, but nothing came of this either. Now, something I didn't tell you was that 7 days before Bernard was found, on January 23rd, there was another boy found about 2 hours away from Taddingstone in Brighton. This boy was found at Waterhall at the Suxon Downs and was thought to be between 10 and 18 years old. However, he was so decompensated at this point that they really had to examine the bones, and they couldn't even see what he really looked like anymore. Once an autopsy was done, they believed that this boy had also been dismembered, and he would be identified as 14-year-old Michael John Trower. And was this a coincidence that these two boys had both been found in similar ways around the same time? Or was this possibly a serial killer? Now, our last suspect is actually twins. They're Ronald and Reginald Cray, also known as the Cray twins, and they were involved in a lot of organized crime at the time of Bernard's murder. They were actually convicted of murdering two men in 1969, and they were arrested for that murder a year after Bernard had been found. This means that they still would have been out at the time that he was murdered, and their case is extremely interesting, the Cray twins. It's a crazy case, so if you want me to do a video on that, just let me know down below. There is a reason why they were thought to be involved in Bernard's murder, and that was because Reginald actually confessed to it, or so people thought. In 2000, there was actually a documentary being filmed about the Cray brothers, and Reginald said that he was the killer of an unknown murder. And once he said that, Reginald's cellmate came forward and said that he had been telling him that he had killed a young gay man. Some believe this was Bernard, however, I'm not sure how all of this talk about Bernard being a gay boy came forward. I'm not sure if it's because the police were looking into gay suspects, but it was never fully said that he was. It would have been fine if he was. However, I'm not sure that it's fair to say that for sure when there's no evidence to prove that. His killer might have been, but that doesn't mean that he was. Others say that Reginald wasn't even talking about Bernard, that this was about his friend and lover, Edward Smith, that disappeared the same year as Bernard. Now, throughout the years, more and more witnesses were coming forward with information about this case, and in 2012, a man named Robert Thurston finally came forward. He said he was just a teen back then, and that a week before Bernard was actually found, Robert was out at about 2 a.m. just kind of messing around with some friends near the Ipswich docks on Key Street when he saw something very strange. That's when he heard a bang, and he walked closer to the R.W. Paul offices and saw two suitcases kind of sitting inside the gate, which he thought was strange. There was no one else around, but then a man would walk in to this area that was like out in the open outside towards the suitcases, and he was holding his hands up like this, like he was about to have to go and wash them, you know what you do when your hands are dirty and you don't want to touch anything, and he was wearing pink gloves. Now, Robert said that he recognized these gloves because he had just had his appendix removed, and they were the ones used by his doctor. Now, I'm not sure if it was ever identified who his doctor was, because I could never find anything that said so, but he did say it was gloves that were used by a doctor. I'm not sure if he was saying that he believed his doctor had done something or just a doctor, but he did identify them as gloves used by one. He said that this man had a really long, drawn face and was well dressed with a long black coat. He said that he was also wearing dark trousers, polished shoes, and Robert said he had tried to talk to police for many years, but they wouldn't listen to him because he was young. They didn't think he knew anything, and so they just ignored his statements. It wasn't that he waited so long to finally come forward, it's that nobody listened to him until then. Another witness would come forward, and that was actually this year in 2019, and she said she wanted to be anonymous, but her daughter really said she needed to tell the police what she knew, what she'd seen. And she said that she was a teen at the time as well, and she had a job exercising the hunt horses, so she would ride them out and about and get them exercise, and that was what she was doing one morning. And she had gone over this hill, she was riding one, she was kind of pulling along the other, and this was in Taddingstone, and then she saw a boy kind of coming up the hill at her carrying a suitcase, and he was covered in freckles, which could have been moles. When Bernard's picture came out in the newspaper, she knew that he was the person she had seen that day. And I'm sorry, I said one suitcase, but he was actually carrying two suitcases, so both of them were accounted for according to this witness statement. This case is still unsolved, and it is often known as the Taddingstone suitcase murder. But what do you think happened to Bernard? You know, working with children, and I've been around several with, you know, mental health issues and who are mentally younger than their peers, something that I've noticed is that they will do almost anything to fit in with them, no matter if it's right or wrong, no matter if they know right from wrong or not. They will often do so, and it's not in a way that is like, you know, everybody tries to fit in with their peers and will do certain dares and stuff. It's an overabundance of, yes, I will do this, and I don't care what I have to do. If it makes me fit in with you, I'm gonna do it. And they don't necessarily even think about that the people could just want them to do something for them, take advantage of them, and not actually be their friends. So it can be quite sad at times. I almost wonder if this witness that came forward that said that she spotted Bernard walking up with the 2 suitcases meant that Bernard had taken these 2 suitcases from whoever he was trying to be friends with on an errand that was possibly to someone who wasn't so good. Possibly the people who sent Bernard with these suitcases knew that Bernard could get in a lot of trouble, could possibly even be killed for what he was giving them. And that's why they sent him as the guinea pig, and they sent this sweet, fragile boy to do their dirty work. Maybe these people didn't do something they were supposed to, or they didn't send the right information in the suitcases, and Bernard was killed for that as a repercussion because they thought that these people would care about Bernard, when I'm not sure that was the case. I mean, Bernard, when he left the house, was going for a night with his friends. He wouldn't have taken 2 huge suitcases with him to just go with his friends. That makes no sense, and his family didn't own these suitcases. So if this girl saw him with them, why did he have them? The only thing I can think of is if he, you know, stole them or borrowed them from a friend and wanted to run away. His parents did just get divorced, so I guess that could be a possibility, but he really got to do what he wanted, so I'm not sure why he wouldn't have taken stuff from his own house. But I do think that that tip about Dr. Reddington being the one seen with a suitcase should have been taken more seriously. It was just kind of pushed away when that is a huge detail. I think either someone who is trained medically or had perfected their craft, were possibly torturing people and were criminals, had done this, because this dismemberment was just too good. Somebody knew exactly what they were doing. So was it a seasoned criminal or a medical expert? I think that those are some of the biggest theories in my mind, at least, is one of those, and I do lean more towards somebody out there taking advantage of Bernard in many different ways, and it does break my heart. It's a very gruesome murder and case, and the fact that this is just kind of gone in circles for years and years and years is just so strange to me, and there's something very iffy about the whole thing. But like always, leave me what you believe down below, any theories you've thought of, and don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.